They had been warned that the fences would be the first thing they saw. Anna Weiss kept her eyes fixed on the horizon as the transport truck rolled to a slow stop, her fingers curled tightly around the rough fabric of her gray sleeve, her breath shallow, measured, controlled, the way she had learned to breathe in field hospitals when panic could cost a life. Around her, the other women sat in silence, backs straight despite exhaustion, each one carrying the same invisible weight of expectation, of stories whispered in crowded barracks and repeated so often they had hardened into truth, that American camps were built to break you, that barbed wire stretched for miles, that guards watched from towers with rifles ready, that once you entered, you disappeared behind steel and discipline and never saw the world the same way again. The engine idled, a low mechanical hum filling the space between heartbeats, and for a moment, no one moved, as if stepping down too soon might make it real. Anna swallowed, tasting dust and something else she could not name. Something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to fear, and she told herself it was only the air, only the long journey, only the exhaustion settling into her bones after weeks of transit across oceans and rail lines and roads that seemed to lead nowhere but here. The truck door opened with a metallic click, sharp and ordinary, and sunlight spilled in, warm and steady, not the harsh glare she had imagined but something softer, something that touched the skin without force. Out, a voice said in English, calm, almost bored, and the women hesitated, exchanging brief glances that said everything without words. This is it, this is where it begins. Anna moved first, not because she was brave but because someone had to, her boots hitting the ground with a dull thud that echoed louder in her mind than it should have, and she lifted her eyes, ready, bracing for the sight she had carried with her for months, coils of barbed wire, towering fences, the unmistakable geometry of confinement. But there was nothing there. The space stretched open in front of her, a wide field of green that rolled gently under a pale blue sky. The air moving freely across it, carrying the faint scent of grass and something distant, something like wood smoke or morning coffee, and for a second, her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing, as if reality itself had misaligned. She turned her head slightly, scanning left, then right, searching for the edges, for the lines that would define this place as a prison, for the barriers that would make sense of everything she had been told, but there were no fences, no wire, no walls. Only a few low buildings set back from the road and a dirt path leading inward as if inviting rather than containing. Behind her, the other women stepped down one by one, their movements slowing as they saw the same absence, the same impossible openness, and a quiet tension settled over them, thicker than fear, because fear at least had a shape, and this did not. Anna felt her pulse quicken. Not with terror but with something closer to confusion, a disorientation that made her grip tighten. Again, as if she needed something solid to hold on to, because if there were no fences, then what was this place, and more importantly, what did that mean for everything she believed? She took a single step forward, then stopped, her body refusing to go farther, as if there was a line she could not see but somehow understood, a boundary drawn not in steel but in expectation, and she realized, with a clarity that unsettled her more than any threat could have, that the thing holding her in place was not the camp at all, but the idea of it, and for the first time since the war had taken everything familiar and turned it into something unrecognizable. Anna Weiss did not know where the limits truly were. No one told them to move again, and that silence carried more weight than any shouted order Anna had expected. The women stood in a loose line beside the truck, their eyes fixed on the open land ahead, waiting for the moment when something would reveal itself, when a guard would raise his voice, when a boundary would be drawn and the illusion of openness would collapse into something familiar, something they could understand. But nothing happened. A man in a pressed uniform stood about 20 feet away, not approaching, not commanding, simply watching with a stillness that felt deliberate, as if he were giving them time rather than taking control of it. And Anna noticed the absence of urgency in his posture, the way his hands rested loosely at his sides instead of gripping anything, the way his gaze moved across them without hardness. Behind her, one of the younger women whispered in German, her voice thin with uncertainty, asking if this was a test, if they were being watched for some mistake they did not yet understand, and no one answered because no one knew. Anna shifted her weight, the dry dirt beneath her boots firm and real, grounding her in a moment that refused to match the stories that had prepared her for this place. She looked again toward the field, tracing the line where grass met sky, searching for towers, for shadows, for any sign that the freedom in front of her was limited in ways she could not yet see. But there was only distance, uninterrupted. Stretching farther than any camp she had imagined could allow, the man in the uniform finally stepped forward, not quickly, not with authority imposed through motion, but with a measured pace that suggested intention rather than control, and when he stopped a few feet away, he spoke in clear, steady English, his voice carrying easily in the open air, saying that they would be housed, fed, and expected to work, that they were under protection, that there would be rules but also fairness, and though Anna understood only parts of his words, she understood the tone, and the tone did not match the fear she had carried across an ocean. He gestured, not sharply, but with an open hand toward the path leading inward, and still, no one moved. The hesitation lingered, thick and unspoken, because stepping forward meant accepting that what they saw might be real, and that was more difficult than bracing for cruelty. Anna felt the eyes of the others on her again, the same silent agreement as before, and she realized that the invisible line in front of her had not disappeared, it had only shifted, no longer drawn by fences or wire, but by belief, by the question of whether they dared to trust what stood in front of them. She inhaled slowly, the air filling her lungs without resistance, and then she stepped forward, one pace, then another, her body tense, waiting for interruption, for correction, for the moment when someone would stop her and restore the world to something predictable. But there was only the sound of her own footsteps, soft against the dirt, and the quiet rustle of grass moving in the breeze. She crossed the space where she thought the boundary should be, and nothing changed. No shout, no signal, no consequence. Behind her, she heard movement as the others began to follow, cautiously at first, then with growing certainty, their formation loosening as they moved into the open, each step dissolving another layer of expectation. Anna kept walking, her eyes forward, her mind struggling to reconcile the absence of force with the reality of her situation, and it occurred to her, slowly, almost reluctantly, that control did not always announce itself, that sometimes it existed in the space where fear used to be, replaced not by pressure, but by choice, and that thought unsettled her more deeply than any fence ever could. The path curved gently through the field, a narrow line of worn earth pressed into the grass by footsteps that had come before them, and Anna followed it without being told, her pace steady but cautious, as if each step still required permission that no one was giving. The buildings ahead grew clearer with every yard, simple wooden structures spaced apart, their windows open to the air, their doors unguarded, and the absence of barriers continued to press against her thoughts, not as relief, but as a question she could not yet answer. A breeze moved across the open land, lifting loose strands of hair from her face, carrying with it the faint scent of brewed coffee and something warm, something cooked, and the normalcy of that smell struck her harder than anything else so far, because it belonged to a life she had not expected to find here. The women around her began to shift, their rigid formation loosening into something more uncertain, more human, as they walked, their eyes moving constantly, searching for structure, for rules that would define their place in this unfamiliar environment. One of them slowed beside Anna, her voice low, asking if they were being observed, if there were guards hidden somewhere beyond sight, and Anna did not answer immediately because she was asking herself the same question, scanning the distance for movement, for silhouettes against the sky, but she saw only a few American soldiers near the buildings, moving with casual purpose, carrying supplies, speaking to one another in voices that rose and fell without urgency. None of them watched the women closely, none of them stepped forward to control their pace, and that absence of attention felt deliberate, as if it were part of the design of the place itself. As they drew closer, Anna noticed details that did not align with what she had imagined: a wooden bench placed outside one of the buildings, a stack of crates left open, a door slightly ajar with no one standing beside it, and she found herself slowing again, her instincts resisting the idea that nothing was being withheld, that nothing was being enforced. The man in the uniform, Captain Hayes, walked a few steps ahead now, not looking back to check if they followed, as if he assumed they would, and that assumption carried a quiet confidence that unsettled her more than any command could have. They reached the first building, and he stopped, turning slightly to indicate the entrance, his gesture simple, almost understated, and still, no one rushed forward. Anna stepped up to the doorway and paused, her hand hovering near the frame, the wood smooth beneath her fingertips when she finally touched it, real and solid, not a threshold designed to contain but one meant to be crossed freely. inside, she could see rows of bunks, neatly arranged, sunlight falling across clean floors, and for a moment, she remained where she was, caught between the instinct to hesitate and the growing realization that hesitation itself was no longer required. Behind her, the others gathered, their presence close but no longer tightly bound, each of them facing the same decision in their own way. Anna took a breath, deeper this time, and stepped inside, her boots sounding softly against the wood, and again, nothing stopped her, nothing changed except the quiet shift within her own understanding, a small fracture in the certainty she had carried for so long. She turned slightly, looking back toward the open field they had crossed, and from this angle, the absence of fences was even more striking, because there was nothing between the place she stood and the world beyond it. No visible line marking where captivity began or ended, and for the first time, she understood that the boundary she had felt earlier had not been placed around the camp, but within herself, drawn by expectation, reinforced by fear, and now, slowly, it was beginning to fade, not through force, but through something far more difficult to confront, the possibility that everything she had believed about this moment might have been wrong. The room held the quiet of a place that expected order without demanding it, sunlight stretching across the wooden floor in long, pale lines that shifted slowly with the movement of the day, and Anna stood just inside the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes adjusting not to darkness, but to clarity, to the unexpected simplicity of what was in front of her. The bunks were arranged in 2 rows, evenly spaced, each with a folded blanket at the foot, the fabric clean, the corners precise, and nothing about the space suggested confinement in the way she had imagined. No bars on the windows, no locks visible on the doors, only openness framed by structure. She stepped further inside, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of a bunk as she passed, the wood smooth and worn by use, not new, but cared for, and she found herself noticing details she would have ignored before, the faint scent of soap in the air, the quiet hum of distant activity outside, the absence of tension that usually filled places where people were held against their will. Behind her, the other women entered slowly, their movements hesitant but curious, each one choosing a place without being told, their belongings minimal, their presence filling the room with a cautious energy that had not yet decided whether it could relax. Anna chose a bunk near the window, drawn not by preference but by instinct, the need to see outside, to maintain a line of sight to the world beyond, and when she sat down, the mattress gave slightly beneath her weight, a small, ordinary sensation that grounded her more than she expected. She placed her hands on her knees, steadying herself, and looked out through the open window, where the field stretched once again into view, uninterrupted. The same expanse she had crossed only minutes before, and it felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. Voices drifted in from outside, low and conversational, American accents blending into a rhythm she did not fully understand but could recognize as normal, unforced, and she listened for signs of command, for the sharp edges of authority, but heard none. A figure passed by the window, one of the soldiers carrying a metal container, and he did not look in, did not pause, his attention fixed on his task, and the lack of scrutiny felt almost intentional, as if they were being given space not as a privilege, but as a standard. One of the women across the room spoke quietly, remarking on the windows, on the fact that they were open, that nothing prevented them from reaching out, from stepping through if they chose, and the statement hung in the air, not as a suggestion, but as a realization that none of them seemed ready to test. Anna shifted slightly, her gaze following the line of the window frame, tracing its edges as if confirming its reality, and she understood that the structure of this place did not rely on what it could physically enforce, but on something less visible, something that required participation rather than resistance. The door behind her remained open, the outside visible from where she sat, and for a brief moment, she imagined standing up, walking back through it, retracing her steps across the field, continuing until the camp disappeared behind her, and the thought did not feel forbidden. Only distant, like a possibility that existed without urgency. She lowered her eyes, focusing again on the room, on the quiet presence of the other women settling into their spaces, and she realized that none of them were moving toward the door, none of them testing the openness that surrounded them, not because they were unable, but because something within them had not yet allowed it. Anna leaned back slightly, the wooden frame of the bunk steady against her shoulders, and exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her with a sense of weight she had not noticed before. and in that moment, she understood that whatever held them here was not built from wood or wire, but from something far more enduring, something that did not need to be seen to be effective, and that realization settled into her with a quiet certainty that would take longer to unravel than any fence ever could. The afternoon settled into the camp without announcement, the light shifting gradually from bright clarity to a softer, warmer tone that stretched shadows across the ground outside, and Anna remained seated for a while longer than she realized, her attention drifting between the room and the open window, as if her mind needed time to catch up with what her eyes had already accepted. Eventually, a quiet movement near the doorway drew her focus, one of the American soldiers stepping inside with a deliberate calm, carrying a metal tray that released a faint curl of steam into the air, and the scent followed a second later, rich and unmistakable, coffee, real coffee, the kind she had not encountered in years, not since before rationing had turned simple comforts into distant memories. He set the tray down on a wooden table near the center of the room, not speaking at first, not announcing his presence, simply placing it there as if it belonged, as if it had always been part of the routine. And then he stepped back, giving space again, the same quiet pattern that defined everything here. The cups were plain, sturdy, filled nearly to the top, the dark surface of the liquid reflecting the light from the window, and for a moment, no one moved, the women watching from their places as if unsure whether this, too, was some kind of test, another unseen boundary waiting to be crossed incorrectly. Anna felt the familiar tension rise in her chest, the instinct to wait, to observe, to let someone else act first, but the stillness stretched too long, and something in her shifted, a small, almost imperceptible decision forming before she could fully explain it. She stood, her movement slow, controlled, and walked toward the table, aware of the eyes following her, aware of the silence deepening around each step. The soldier met her gaze briefly, not with expectation, not with insistence, but with something neutral, something steady. And he gave the slightest nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed. Yet it carried enough meaning to remove the last hesitation. Anna reached out, her fingers closing around the handle of one of the cups, the warmth immediate against her skin, real and undeniable, and she paused for just a second, the memory of everything she had been told pressing against the moment, the warnings, the stories, the certainty that kindness from an enemy was never without cost. She lifted the cup slowly, bringing it closer, the steam rising faintly, carrying that familiar scent. And then, without ceremony, she took a small sip. The taste was strong, bitter, and clean, exactly what it should have been, nothing hidden, nothing altered, and the simplicity of it struck her with a quiet force that she could not easily describe. She lowered the cup slightly, her eyes remaining on its surface as if it might change, as if something would reveal itself after the fact, but nothing did. Behind her, she heard movement as the others began to rise, one by one, drawn not by instruction but by observation, by the proof contained in a single action, and soon the room filled with the soft sounds of cups being lifted, of cautious sips turning into something more certain. The soldier did not stay to watch, did not wait for a reaction, he simply turned and stepped back outside, leaving them with the tray, with the coffee, with the quiet understanding that no explanation was coming because none was needed. Anna returned to her bunk, the cup still warm in her hands, and sat down again, her gaze drifting once more to the open window, to the field beyond, and this time, the absence of fences felt different, not like a question, but like an answer she had not been ready to hear before. She took another sip, slower now, letting the moment settle fully, and realized that whatever this place was, it was not trying to convince her of anything, it was simply allowing her to see, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to resist, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to reject, only the quiet, steady presence of something she had been taught could not exist, and yet here it was, as ordinary and undeniable as the warmth in her hands. Evening came slowly, not with a command or signal, but with a gradual dimming of light that softened the edges of everything, turning the open field beyond the window into a stretch of muted gold and shadow, and Anna remained where she was, the empty cup now resting on the small wooden surface beside her bunk, its warmth gone but its presence still carrying the weight of what it had represented. Around her, the room had changed in subtle ways, the tension that had filled it earlier loosening into something quieter, something less defined, as the women moved more freely, their voices still low but no longer confined to whispers, the sound of conversation returning in fragments, cautious but real, Anna stood after a while, drawn again to the window, her steps unhurried, and she placed her hand lightly against the frame, looking out across the same open ground that had unsettled her so deeply before, and this time, she did not search for fences. Instead, she watched the horizon, the way the land seemed to continue without interruption, the way nothing marked the limits of where she could go except distance itself. A figure crossed the field at a steady pace, one of the American soldiers, his silhouette outlined against the fading light, and he walked without looking toward the building, without checking the windows, his attention fixed ahead as if the presence of the camp behind him required no supervision. Anna followed his movement with her eyes until he disappeared behind another structure, and the simplicity of that moment lingered, the quiet confidence it suggested, the absence of suspicion. Behind her, one of the women approached, stopping a few feet away, her posture less rigid now, her voice steady. As she asked, in careful words, whether Anna had noticed that no one had counted them, no roll call, no verification, no visible system of control that matched what they had expected. Anna nodded slightly, her gaze still outward, because she had noticed, and the realization had been growing in her since they arrived, not as a single moment, but as a series of small, undeniable details that formed a larger truth. She turned back toward the room, her eyes moving across the others, some seated, some standing, each one occupying the space in a way that felt less temporary, less guarded, and she understood that something had shifted not only in her, but in all of them, though none had said it directly. She walked toward the door, her steps measured, and stopped at the threshold, the same threshold she had crossed earlier without fully understanding what it meant. Now, she paused there, looking out once more, aware that nothing stood in her way, no barrier, no instruction, no visible consequence, and the openness of that moment carried a different kind of weight, one that required a decision rather than obedience. She stepped outside, the air cooler now, the evening settling in, and she took a few steps away from the building, her pace slow, deliberate, as if testing not the space, but herself. The ground felt the same beneath her boots, the distance unchanged, the world as open as it had been before, and still, she did not keep walking. She stopped after a short distance, turning slightly, her eyes returning to the building, to the window she had stood behind, to the place that had already begun to feel defined not by confinement, but by something harder to name. She remained there for a moment, the quiet surrounding her, the absence of command, the absence of force, and she realized that the question was no longer whether she could leave, but whether she would, and that question did not have a simple answer. Anna exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cooling air, and then she turned back, retracing her steps without hesitation, not because she was being kept, but because she was choosing to return, and that choice settled into her with a clarity that was both steady and unsettling, because it revealed something she had not expected to confront, that freedom, when it was real, did not always feel like escape. Sometimes it felt like responsibility, and sometimes, it felt like staying. The night settled fully over the camp with a quiet certainty, the sky deepening into a wide, uninterrupted stretch of dark blue scattered with stars that seemed closer here, unobstructed by anything that might break their pattern, and Anna lay on her bunk with her hands folded loosely over her chest, her eyes open, not from restlessness, but from the unfamiliar stillness that surrounded her. The room had grown quiet, the soft breathing of the other women filling the space in a steady rhythm, a kind of collective exhale after a day none of them had expected, and yet sleep did not come easily, not because of fear, but because of the absence of it, because her mind kept searching for something to hold on to, some sign that would confirm this place operated by the rules she understood. She turned her head slightly, looking toward the window where the night air moved gently through the open frame, carrying with it the distant sound of footsteps on gravel, voices low and indistinct, and somewhere farther away, the faint clink of metal against metal, ordinary sounds that belonged to routine rather than control. She listened carefully, trying to separate meaning from noise, trying to find the pattern that would reveal how this place truly functioned, but the sounds did not form commands, they did not suggest urgency, they simply existed, as natural as the shifting of wind through the grass. After a while, she sat up slowly, her movements quiet so as not to disturb the others, and placed her feet on the floor, the wood cool beneath her soles, grounding her again in the present moment. She stood and moved toward the window, drawn once more to the openness beyond it, and when she reached the frame, she paused, looking out into the darkness where the field stretched unseen but still present, its boundaries defined only by distance and shadow. A single lantern glowed faintly near one of the buildings, its light steady, casting a small circle that seemed almost insignificant against the vastness around it, and within that circle, a soldier sat on a crate, leaning slightly forward, his posture relaxed, his attention on a small notebook in his hands. He did not look up, did not scan the surroundings, did not perform the role Anna had expected of someone tasked with watching, and that detail held her attention longer than anything else. Because it suggested a level of trust she could not yet fully understand, she rested her hand on the window frame again, the wood familiar now, and considered the distance between where she stood and where the soldier sat, the space that separated them open, unguarded, and she realized that she could walk there if she chose, she could cross that distance without being stopped, without being questioned, and the thought did not feel dangerous, it felt possible. Behind her, one of the women shifted in her sleep. A soft movement that reminded Anna of where she was, of the shared space, the shared experience that had begun to reshape itself in ways none of them had anticipated. She remained at the window for a long moment, her gaze steady, her breathing even, and then she stepped back, returning to her bunk with the same quiet steps she had taken before, her body easing into the familiar position, her head resting against the thin pillow. She closed her eyes this time, not because she had found certainty, but because she no longer needed to search for it in the same way, and as she lay there, listening to the soft sounds of the night, she understood that the absence of fences was not an omission, not something forgotten or overlooked. It was a statement, one that did not demand agreement, only recognition, and in that recognition, something within her shifted again, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the way she would see the morning when it came, because for the first time, she was not waiting to be controlled, she was waiting to understand. Morning arrived without announcement, the darkness thinning into a pale gray that slowly revealed the shapes of the room, the outlines of bunks, the quiet figures still resting, and Anna opened her eyes before the others, not from habit, but from a sense of anticipation she could not fully explain. For a moment, she remained still, listening, expecting the sharp call of orders, the structured beginning of a day defined by control, but what came instead was softer, the distant sound of footsteps on gravel, a door opening somewhere outside, the low murmur of voices beginning their routines without urgency. She sat up slowly, her gaze moving to the window where the first light stretched across the field, the same open expanse, unchanged, waiting without expectation. She stood and crossed the room, her steps quiet, her movement no longer hesitant but still deliberate, as if she were aware that each action now carried a different kind of meaning. Outside, the air held a cool freshness, the kind that came before the heat of the day, and she stepped through the doorway again, not pausing this time, not measuring the distance, simply moving forward because she chose to. A few of the other women followed, their presence close but not clustered, each one beginning to occupy the space in her own way, their eyes moving not with fear, but with observation. Near one of the buildings, a small group of American soldiers stood beside a wooden table, setting out items in an orderly manner, plates, cups, utensils, their movements efficient but unhurried, and the simplicity of the scene carried a quiet normalcy that continued to unsettle and reassure at the same time. Anna approached slowly, her gaze steady, and one of the soldiers looked up briefly, offering a nod that acknowledged her presence without directing it, without defining it, and then returned to his task. There was no instruction, no command to line up, no enforced order, and yet, the women began to gather, forming a loose arrangement that mirrored structure without being imposed. Anna reached the table and paused, her eyes moving over the items, recognizing them not as rations to be controlled, but as something closer to a shared routine. And she realized that what guided this moment was not authority, but expectation, not enforced, but understood. She picked up a plate, her hand steady, and stepped aside, allowing space for the others. Her movement natural, unforced, and she noticed that no one rushed, no one pushed forward, the rhythm of the group forming quietly, as if shaped by something internal rather than external. As she stood there, holding the plate, she became aware of a shift that had taken place without a clear point of origin, a change not in the environment, but in the way she responded to it, the way she no longer searched for limits in the same way, no longer waited for correction before acting. She looked out again across the field, the light now stronger, revealing details that had been hidden in shadow, and she understood that the openness of this place was not meant to confuse, it was meant to reveal, to show what remained when control was removed, and in that moment, standing there with the others, participating in a routine that required no enforcement, Anna felt something settle within her. A quiet clarity that did not arrive with certainty, but with acceptance, the understanding that the absence of fences had not created freedom, it had simply exposed it, and what they did with that freedom was no longer determined by those who held power, but by themselves. The rhythm of the camp settled into something steady as the morning unfolded, not imposed, not enforced, but repeated through small, consistent actions that no one had to explain, and Anna moved within it with a growing sense of clarity, her steps no longer measured by hesitation, but by awareness. The field beyond the buildings remained open, unchanged, its quiet presence now less of a question and more of a constant, something she no longer needed to test because she understood what it represented. As the hours passed, the women were given simple tasks, work that filled the day without pressure, without raised voices, instructions offered in calm tones, gestures replacing words when language failed, and Anna found herself responding not out of fear, but out of recognition, the understanding that participation here was expected in a different way, one that did not rely on force. She worked alongside the others, her hands steady, her movements familiar, and there were moments when she forgot entirely where she was. When the act itself became the focus, not the circumstances that had brought her here, during a pause, she stepped away briefly, drawn once again to the edge of the open space, her gaze moving across the horizon that still held no visible limit, and she stood there for a moment, not searching, not questioning, simply observing. Behind her, voices continued, low and even, the sound of activity blending into a pattern that felt almost ordinary, and she realized that the absence of tension had become its own kind of presence, something she could feel without needing to define. Captain Hayes passed nearby, his pace unhurried, his attention on the work being done rather than on those doing it, and when his eyes met hers for a brief second, there was no message in the glance, no reminder of authority, only acknowledgement, and then he moved on. Anna remained where she was, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, and she understood that whatever held this place together was not visible, not something that could be pointed to or resisted. It existed in the space between actions, in the consistency of behavior that required no reinforcement. She looked down at her hands, at the small traces of dust left from the work, and then back toward the buildings, toward the open doors and windows, toward the movement of people who carried on without guarding every motion, and she felt a quiet shift settle fully into place. The stories she had believed, the images she had carried with her, they had all depended on something solid, something to oppose, something to confirm the role she had expected to play, but here, there was nothing to oppose, nothing to push against, and without that, the role itself began to dissolve. She turned away from the field and walked back toward the others, her step certain, not because she had been told where to go, but because she had decided. The space behind her remained open, unchanged, offering the same possibility it had from the beginning, and yet it no longer pulled at her in the same way. As she reached the building, she paused briefly at the doorway, her hand resting against the frame, the same simple which she had touched the day before, and she understood that the boundary she had once felt so strongly was gone, not removed by anyone else, but by her own willingness to see what had been in front of her all along. She stepped inside, joining the others without hesitation, and as the day continued, she carried with her a realization that did not need to be spoken, did not need to be proven, because it had already taken hold. They had expected to be contained, to be defined by walls and wire and force, but what they found instead was something quieter, something harder to resist, because it did not demand anything at all. It simply revealed the truth and left them to decide what to do with it. And Anna Weiss, standing in that space between expectation and reality, understood at last that no fence had been removed, because none had ever been needed.